From July 23 to 25, Kuleba was in China, not in Beijing, but in Gwangju. Also, for many of our viewers, I will say that in fact this was not the first visit of the Ukrainian chief diplomat, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine in 12 years, as many people replicated, and we did something on our air, because in an exclusive interview with me, Pavlo Klimkin, then Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine in 2014 to 2019, noted, record that in 2016 there was also a direct visit to China. By the way, he was received in Beijing. China, meanwhile, continues shuttle diplomacy and sends a special envoy to the countries of the global roster for consultations on Ukraine. The Chinese government's special representative for Eurasian Affairs, Li Hui, will leave for Brazil on July 28. Let me remind you that Brazil now has a common, so to speak, peace initiative plan. It is already taking 6 steps, but it was about him, by the way, that his colleagues talked about when he was on a visit to Beijing. Li Hui will go to South Africa and Indonesia. There he will hold consultations on Ukraine. This was stated by Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning. On July 28, which is tomorrow, China will send the special representative of the Chinese government for Eurasian Affairs, Li Hui, to these countries, where the 4th round, as China believed, shuttle diplomacy on the Ukrainian crisis will be held. Unfortunately, this is how the Russian-Ukrainian war continues to be called in China. This is what Mao says. Li will hold an exchange with key countries in the global roster on the current situation in Ukraine and advance peace consultations.
Our goal is to contribute to de-escalation and create conditions for the resumption of peace talks. The crisis has been going on for more than 2 years, but the fighting continues. There is a risk of further escalation and expansion of the conflict, which is of concern to the international community. China is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a responsible great power. Our country has always been firmly committed to the political settlement of the crisis.
Borrell is with us calling on China to influence Russia to end the war in Ukraine. The European Union's chief diplomat, José Borrell, met with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, with whom Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs Dmytro Kuleba met this week on the sidelines of the Regional Forum of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, in Laos. It happened on July 26. During the meeting, the general relations between the European Union and Beijing were discussed. This was reported by the European External Action Service. Borrell said the EU and China should acknowledge their mutual concerns. Moreover, trade is carried out on a large scale between them. It is necessary to find a consensus on those issues that remain controversial. I add, first of all, it is about China's support, according to Borrell, of Russia's aggressive war against Ukraine, which negatively affects these relations between the European Union and Beijing. The EU's top diplomat explained why the Union considers Russia's war against Ukraine an existential threat to Europe as a whole, and also expressed concern that the export of large quantities of dual-use goods from China to Russia supports Russia in building up military equipment. Borrell asked Beijing to use its influence with Moscow to help end the war, and also called on China to support the peace process. The chief diplomat of the European Union believes that the joint statement between Beijing and Brazil of May 2024, which we have mentioned, does not contribute to movement in this direction. Another concern of the EU in its relations with China is the impact of Beijing's economic policies and production subsidies, which cause distortions in the European market. The Union believes that China should address the root causes of unbalanced trade relations. Regarding Taiwan, Borrell confirmed that the position of the European Union has not changed. The EU, as Kuleba spoke about in Guangzhou, adheres to the One China policy, recognizing the official government of Beijing. At the same time, the European Union continues to cooperate closely with Taiwan in a wide range of areas, without establishing formal diplomatic ties with the island. As for the Middle East, it was also discussed. The EU's top diplomat inquired about the outcome of a meeting of several Palestinian groups that took place last week in Beijing. On the stream with Klimkin, you can see on YouTube 24 that China has actually turned on such a turbo mode of diplomacy with a propeller this week. Borrell believes that divisions between Palestinian groups have hurt the Palestinian people. The EU's top diplomat called for efforts to bridge these differences and stressed that the EU remains consistent in supporting a two-state solution. resolution. The Chinese government, despite deepening cooperation with the Russian Federation, denies providing military support to Russia in the war against Ukraine. But Beijing helps the Russian defense industry, in particular, through the export of high-tech components and similar goods. Let's move on, friends. Borrell is not the only one calling on China to influence the Russian terrorist federation. Britain is with us. Britain called on China not to allow its companies to support the Russian army. British Foreign Secretary David Lemmy, during a meeting with his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi, called on China not to allow its companies to support the Russian army. This was reported by Reuters with reference to the British Foreign Office. The Foreign Secretary stressed Britain's unwavering commitment to Ukraine and called on China to prevent its companies from supporting the Russian military-industrial complex, which poses a threat to international security and prosperity, the Foreign Ministry said in a statement. Lemmy and Yi discussed this on the sidelines of the ASEAN Foreign Ministers event in Laos. And it was their first meeting since Lemmy took office following the Labour Party's victory in the UK election on July 4. Earlier, the head of the Strategic Review of Britain's Defence Potential, George Robertson, said that China and the Russian Federation pose a mortal threat to the UK and the NATO bloc as a whole. Germany is with us. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock called on the Chinese government to work more intensively for peace in Ukraine. The statement of the German minister is quoted by Tagesschau. Baerbock noted that China, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, is obliged to do everything so that we can restore peace. The first thing this will mean first of all is no support for the aggressor, no support for Russia, she stressed. Baerbock also added that the visit of Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba to Beijing is important. China is helping to develop Russia's industry, which it stated in the confrontation with Ukraine, writes the Washington Post. In 2023, China exported $390 million worth of metalworking machines to Russia, up from $94 million a year earlier. By the way, Antony Blinken, Secretary of State of the United States of America, spoke about the machines back in June, when Jens Stoltenberg visited him when preparations were underway for the anniversary NATO summit, which took place in mid-July in Washington. According to Pavel Luzin, a Tufts University scientist and an expert on the Russian armed forces, 90% of the machines imported to Russia come from China, according to Antony Blinken, and those produced in Russia contain Chinese components and engines. Analysts say Beijing, which tightly controls its private sector, has allowed companies to continue doing whatever business they want with Moscow, which benefits both countries, and NATO will not be able to stop exports of dual-use goods such as laser machines without effort from the Chinese government. But Beijing still has little incentive to take a tougher stance on dual-use exports to Russia. The reason is the intensification of economic rivalry with the United States, according to Professor Chen of the University of Albany. Sanctions, the newspaper notes, are unlikely to help stop the flow of machine tools and components. On the contrary, isolation could prompt the Chinese company to increase business ties with Moscow. A sanctioned company is free to move its entire business to Russia, says Jack Watling, a researcher at the UK's Royal United Services Institute, RUSI. Since it will have no alternative markets, it may well take such a step. Russia, meanwhile, is reviving the DPRK's economy. Dictators unite. This is this autocratic axis of evil. Russia, North Korea, Iran, China. China is somewhere on both sides, but still with them. According to North Korea's official data, North Korea's gross domestic product grew by 33.1% in 2023 compared to the previous year, Bloomberg reports. The increase came amid active arms sales to Russia and the lifting of border restrictions imposed at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, which restricted trade. Heavy and chemical industries led economic growth, up 8.1% from the previous year, the Bank of Korea said. While the report does not specify whether these industries are engaged in weapons production, it does note an increase in the production of primary metals such as iron, steel, copper, nickel, and aluminum. Despite one of the biggest gains since Kim Jong-un came to power in 2011, North Korea remains one of the poorest countries in the world. UN agencies report that a large part of the population suffers from a lack of food, medicine and other basic necessities. Gross national income, which measures the total wealth earned by individuals and businesses in the country, was 40.9 trillion won, which is $29.5 billion last year, which is only 1.6 of that of South Korea. For example, GNI per capita was only 1.6 million won, which is 30% of South Korea's corresponding indicator. We see that Russia is coming to the rescue, so to speak, and in some strange way believes that cooperation with the DPRK, Iran, and not only will bring it victory, but we understand that this obviously only delays its death. At least, that's what we want to believe. But I don't know whether China will agree to persuasion, motivation and calls from Ukraine's Western allies, which, as we see, were voiced from the European Union, Britain, Germany, and the United States. Repeatedly, this is heard in all bilateral and not only negotiations, and on all platforms.